On this episode of Taking Into Account, Linus Torvalds recently sat down for an interview, and he fears that he can no longer say, quote, silly, stupid crap anymore. We're going to discuss that today. Also, Linux gaming won't find a mainstream audience until three things happen. And for over 10 years, VMware was accused of illegally using Linux code. That lawsuit is now dropped. Wouldn't it be great if you could run all your Android apps on Linux? Well, announcing a new project called SPURV. And the next big Ubuntu and Fedora releases are getting that much closer. The betas are out. These are 5 stories that I will be taking into account. And the first story on the docket tonight is Linus Torvalds recently sat down to do an interview over at Linux Journal. So Linux Journal has recently celebrated, I guess, their 25th year anniversary, and apparently one of their very first issues 25 years ago was an interview of Linus Torvalds by a guy named Robert Young. So they decided, hey, after 25 years, wouldn't it be great to do basically an interview again between Robert Young and Linus Torvalds here at Linux Journal. And it is a rather lengthy interview. Of course, I won't discuss everything here in the interview, but I do want to hit a few, I guess, interesting bits, things that I found interesting as far as in the wake of the code of conduct controversy and some other things I thought were really interesting, things I didn't know about Linus before reading this article. One of the first points that Bob, the interviewer here, brought up was that Linus Torvalds, I guess, used to joke in the early days of Linux that one of his goals with Linux was, quote, world domination. Which is interesting because when somebody says that, you know, obviously you don't take them seriously, but it's funny because, of course, world domination, that is essentially what Linux has actually achieved, according to Linus here. Quote, well, I stopped doing that world domination joke long ago because it seemed to become less of a joke as time went on. But it always was a joke, and it wasn't why I or any of the other developers really did what we did anyway. It was just always making better technology and having interesting challenges. Linus goes on also talking about back in 1994, you know, he was mostly a developer back then. He wasn't... he was the lead maintainer, but his role is completely different nowadays than it was, 25 years ago. So the big picture really hasn't changed as far as what the Linux kernel and the development of the kernel is, but Linus's role within that has changed drastically in the last 25 years. And Bob here asks Linus, where does he see himself in a quarter century? Will he still be working on the kernel? Linus says, well, I'll be 75 by then, and I doubt I'll be involved day to day. Yeah, I wouldn't expect somebody, at 75 to be involved in a project as time-consuming as maintaining the Linux kernel. Also, by then, Linus will have been involved with kernel development for 55 years at that point. Another 25 years. He's already been working on the kernel for the last 3 decades. So Linus at some point, I'm sure, will retire, but there are good people involved with the Linux kernel. The Linux kernel runs just fine, even when Linus goes on vacation for a few weeks or a few months even. It's not like the Linux kernel is not completely dependent on Linus Torvalds. It has evolved beyond just being Linus Torvalds' baby, right? Bob goes on to ask Linus a question about the Linux code base. He asks Linus, does he ever envision maybe the Linux kernel doing a major rewrite and switching from the C programming language over to, quote, a more modern programming language? Linus does not see that really ever happening. He doesn't really see an alternative to the C programming language. He says nothing better has come around in the last 30 years that he's been working on the kernel. So C it is. Of course, the C programming language has evolved and changed quite a bit in the last 30 years. But for the most part, the language is recognizably the same as it was 30 years ago when Linus first started developing the kernel. And reading a little bit here, quote, and honestly, it doesn't look likely to change. The kind of languages people see under active development aren't for low-level system programming. So the popular programming languages out there, the new hot programming languages everybody wants to get into, they're easier to use than C. So that's why people jump on them, but they are not for what Linus is talking about here, low-level system programming, which is what the kernel is all about. These, new and latest and greatest flashy programming languages people are getting into are used to create usually graphical programs, applications with fancy UIs and all these whiz-bang features. For system level, low-level programming, C is kind of the standard, and that is why the kernel probably will continue to develop in C for the foreseeable future. Bob asks Linus a question about hardware. What does he run? He asks Linus, is there a Stradivarius of Linux laptops out there? And when he says Stradivarius, there's a very expensive line of violins out there for those of you that are familiar with classical music. Stradivarius was a famous violin maker centuries ago, and some of those instruments are worth millions of dollars. I mean, they're really priceless pieces of equipment. So he's asking Linus, is there a Stradivarius of Linux laptops out there? Basically, what's the best Linux laptop out there? And Linus says he basically just uses a very generic PC workstation, nothing special. Your typical Linux desktop user, right? Most of us don't really run the latest and greatest hardware. We typically are not running special equipment. I mean, the Linux kernel supports just about everything anyway, so there's no reason to go out there. It's not like Windows where you really need a beefy machine anyway to run the latest and greatest version of Windows. So I'm not shocked that Linus says he runs a very generic PC workstation. As far as laptops, he says the best compromise for me right now is the XPS 13. So that's the Dell XPS 13, which is really designed and aimed for developers. Kind of an expensive laptop. I think it runs a little over $1,000. I want to say it's about $1,200 for that particular laptop. Great laptop. Does ship with Linux. Well, it ships with Windows on it, but you can get it installed with Linux from Dell. They do offer to install Ubuntu on the XPS 13. I don't think Linus runs Ubuntu, though. I think last somebody asked him, he was using Fedora. I could be wrong about that. Other interesting tidbits from the interview, Linus mentions that, the way people use a PC now is not the same. Lots of people now mainly interact through their web browsers. Maybe they run a couple of apps on their computer every day, but it's not like it was, 20, 30 years ago. Pretty much everything is web-based now. Bob goes on to ask Linus about if there was one thing he could fix out there in the networked world, so we're talking the internet, what would it be? And Linus basically says he detests modern social media. He's talking about Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. He calls them, quote, a disease. It seems to encourage bad behavior. Linus, I couldn't agree with you more. Social media is a disease, obviously. I completely agree with that. I think Twitter especially really encourages bad behavior. Just that format. Twitter is nothing but a hate machine. Facebook and Instagram, not much better. Now, Linus goes on to also criticize email. I actually really like email. I would rather converse through email with people than on social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook. But Linus does admit email also has a problem because it's just plain text. Quote, on the internet, nobody can hear you being subtle. When you're not talking to somebody face to face, you miss all the normal social cues. It's easy to miss humor and sarcasm because it's also very easy to overlook the reaction of the recipient. So you get things like flame wars. So basically, he's right. People do misunderstand you a lot on the internet, whether it's a forum post or through email or through chat, IRC chat. It's because when you're just dealing with plain text, you don't have those social cues, those facial expressions. People don't really know. Are you joking? Are you being serious? Are you trying to be kind of mean or hateful? Or, were you just making a maybe off-color joke? People really can't tell what's going on when all they have to judge you by is plain text. Linus mentions he's not on any social media platforms. He did try Google Plus for a little while because, quote, people on it weren't the mindless usual stuff. So I guess the crowd over on Google Plus was a little better crowd than what was on things like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. But of course, Google Plus is no longer around. That's dead. Bob goes on to ask Linus about his willingness to call a spade in public debates on Linux technology decisions. So a lot of people really love that kind of brash and blunt style of Linus, where somebody does something dumb as far as the Linux code, and he belittles them, berates them publicly. It is kind of entertaining and funny, and a lot of people really like that about Linus, but of course, a lot of people don't like that about Linus. It has driven some people away from kernel development in the past, and Linus has not acknowledged that, and he wants to change some of what how he behaves with other people. So Linus mentions that now he's trying to become a little quieter. Maybe he doesn't say he wants to be more diplomatic, but he wants to be more self-aware and to not be as forceful as he has been in the past. Part of the problem, according to Linus, is the kernel has just gotten too big as far as the people involved. Back in the day, everybody kind of knew Linus, so when he said something dumb, they didn't take it as personally as they do now, because now there's thousands of people involved in kernel development. Some of these people don't really know Linus. They don't know about his personality. They've never met him personally, and they maybe never even really talked through him through an email or a mailing list or anything. So now he has to kind of watch what he says. Also, people read Linus kind of in a different way than they did 30 years ago. And of course, Linus has become, I guess, notorious now for those kinds of outbursts. So he's kind of watching what he says. He mentions that nowadays I can't say silly, stupid crap anymore. So Linus is, I guess, trying to turn over a new leaf, a quieter, a kinder, gentler Linus Torvalds. And the second story on the docket tonight is about Linux gaming. This article comes from over at Forbes, so Jason Evangelo does some really nice articles featured over at Forbes.com. Linux gaming won't find a mainstream audience until 3 things happen. So Jason Evangelo has really become one of the leading Linux journalists since he started basically putting Linux out there in the forefront here on Forbes.com. Jason just switched to Linux just a few months ago from Windows. He was a Windows user that came to Linux, and of course he's been documenting it on Forbes, especially focusing on the gaming aspect of Linux. So according to Jason, though, there are 3 things that until Linux solves these 3 problems, Linux will never become adopted by the masses. It just will not. Jason writes that, quote, gaming on Linux is both amazing and terrible, depending on your point of view. I would agree with that. He mentions that according to market share, Steam on Linux remains less than 1% as far as we have Linux users on the Steam platform. Yeah, that number never really seems to rise. That 1 to 2% is kind of where we've hovered at forever, really since Steam launched. We just don't really gain any ground. But anyway, what 3 things need to happen for Linux to be adopted by the masses, according to Jason Evangelo here? 1, consistency across Linux distros. He has a point here. So installing Steam, for example, and Proton, it's not the same on every Linux distro. Getting your drivers installed, maybe you need the proprietary drivers, especially you folks that are running NVIDIA cards like myself. It's a different process depending on which distribution you're running. You're going to have different driver versions available in different distros. It is not a consistent experience the way it is on Windows, and that's the problem. So he mentions that he's currently trying 4 distributions in a study. I guess he's planning a total of 9 distros that he wants to try. It looks like he's going to try Fedora, Pop! OS, Debian, Solus, Manjaro, Mint, Elementary, Ubuntu, and is that Peppermint? I think that's the Peppermint logo. Anyway, so he's going to try 9 different Linux distributions and see how consistent they are as far as getting Steam and Proton and everything up and running. I can tell you some of these are more problematic than others. Obviously, a rolling distro like Manjaro, great. Ubuntu, Steam is actually developed and officially supported on Ubuntu. That's pretty good. Fedora is actually pretty good if you know what you're doing, but you do have to enable non-free repos in Fedora. You have to go and enable some non-free repos that are not enabled by default in Fedora to get the best experience, to get Proton and Steam. Maybe you need the latest drivers. Debian, if you're doing your typical Debian stable install, you could have some real issues trying to get a good experience with Steam and Proton on Debian stable. So again, there's no real consistency among all the distros. So his first point here, I absolutely agree with. And then he also mentions that the driver situation can be puzzling to new users. If you're using an AMD card, for example, you have a Radeon card. Should you use the open source Mesa drivers? Or should you go and install AMD's proprietary drivers? Well, on AMD, it really doesn't matter too much. The open source AMD drivers are really good. So you can actually use the AMD drivers and have a pretty good experience. The same question, of course, comes up with NVIDIA users. Should you use the open source Nouveau drivers or the proprietary NVIDIA drivers? You have to use the proprietary NVIDIA drivers if you want to have a good gaming experience. The open source Nouveau drivers for NVIDIA are garbage. It's just a hot mess. They're not usable. But again, do new users know this? And then when you have to go get that proprietary NVIDIA driver, how do you do that? Well, in Ubuntu, it's simple. You open up the little driver program, the graphical program that goes out and installs all the proprietary drivers for your Wi-Fi card and your graphics card. In Ubuntu, it's dead simple. It pretty much takes care of itself for you. On other distributions, you may have to do it in the terminal. You may have to enable a non-free repo and then install that package in the terminal. A new user is not going to like that. Moving forward here, he mentions problem number 2 that has to be solved is the Fortnite problem. Fortnite is one of the most popular games on the planet. Everybody plays it. He also talks about Battle Royale shooter Apex Legends attracted 25 million players in its first week of existence. Both of these games are unplayable on Linux despite the best efforts of Lutris and other developers. The problem why these games do not work on Steam with Proton is because of the anti-cheat mechanisms that these games employ. They use something called EAC, Easy Anti-Cheat, and if you're running Steam on Linux, you can't play these games, basically. Other problems along the way, similar to the Fortnite problem, you guys remember a few months back I did a Taking Into Account episode where I mentioned Blizzard games, specifically Overwatch. They banned a bunch of people that ran Overwatch on Linux because their anti-cheat system, Blizzard's anti-cheat system, falsely detected that they were hacking. They weren't hacking the game. They were just using a different operating system than what the game was built to run on, Windows. So a lot of these people ended up getting their Blizzard accounts basically locked, and Blizzard went out of their way to kind of fix the issue, but still, this is a problem. You know, some of these Windows-only games that were designed to run on Windows, it's a problem, especially when you get things involved like these anti-cheat methods that are out there to detect those people that are doing scandalous things on Windows. Sometimes when you're running things on Linux or through Wine, it's going to falsely detect that you are hacking the game, and you're going to get banned, and you may actually lose access to that game. You may have your account locked or your key locked. Point number 3 that Jason writes here is Linux users need to rally behind a flagship distro. He makes a point that if we had one Linux distro that all the game companies could develop for, yeah, gaming would be great on Linux, but he misses the point here. This is not what Linux is about. Linux is about freedom, right? The freedom to create your own distro, to fork your own distro, to fork other software projects that are licensed under a free license. We are not about consolidating under one flag. That is not what this community is about. I know Jason is kind of new to Linux and maybe open source, but while he makes a point, yes, if there was only one Linux distro, the gaming experience would be better. We're never going to have just one Linux distro that everybody just adopts. So it's pointless to even bring it up, because that is kind of antithetical to the free and open source software movement. Again, I get his point, but it's not worth discussing that third point. But I do really enjoy reading Jason Evangelo's articles over on Forbes.com. I hope he keeps them coming. I think he is actually doing God's work out there, because he is spreading the message about Linux really to the masses. And the third story on the docket tonight involves the lawsuit surrounding VMware. So VMware was accused of illegally using some Linux code in some of its products. So The Linux kernel, of course, is licensed under the GPL. The GPL version 2 is what the kernel is licensed under. And since it is licensed under the GPL, there are, of course, restrictions that are placed on what you can do with that code because of the GPL. And VMware, I guess, decided they didn't want to abide by the license of the Linux kernel. They just were going to do whatever they wanted to do with the Linux kernel and not properly relicense things. So VMware, I mentioned last week on the last week's episode of Taking Into Account episode 35, I did a story. The lead story was about the Linux Foundation and how a lot of people really have a problem with what the Linux Foundation has become recently over the past few years. VMware is a member of the Linux Foundation. They are a sponsor of the Linux Foundation. They contribute a lot of money to the Linux Foundation. Yet, for the last 10 years, there has been this lawsuit against them about them illegally using Linux code in some of their stuff, not properly licensing things, code that was licensed under the GPL, basically just ripping that stuff off and not properly relicensing it. That concerns me. Again, VMware, a member of the Linux Foundation, was doing this. I think that should concern more people than what it seems to. So way back in August 2006, there's a well-known Linux developer. His name is Christopher Hellwig. He spotted the Linux source code being used illegally in VMware's ESX bare metal virtual machine hypervisor. So Hellwig, with the aid of the Software Freedom Conservancy, eventually sued VMware. So the Software Freedom Conservancy, let me open up their website, is basically a non-profit organization that helps promote and defend free, libre, and open source software projects. So they're the ones out there that if you do something dumb, like take something that was licensed under a free license and don't abide by that license, they will sue you. So that is what Hellwig and the Software Freedom Conservancy did to VMware. That lawsuit has been pending since August 2006. It is 2019, folks. Anyway, a German court recently decided that they were going to dismiss the lawsuit. I guess they placed some pretty strict requirements on what Hellwig and the Software Freedom Conservancy had to prove in order to be successful in their lawsuit against VMware. So they finally just dismissed the lawsuit. But I will give VMware some credit. They knew that what they did was wrong, and they have taken action to remove some of the offending code from their products. So basically, the heart of the lawsuit is this ESX hypervisor of VMware's. So it contains some of the Linux code. The Linux code is licensed under the GPL. So VMware, what they did is they took that code, put it in that ESX hypervisor, but they did not license it under a derivative work from Linux. They didn't, license it under the GPL. Really, all they had to do was just relicense what they did and maybe put Linux's GPL version 2, the same version of the GPL Linux was already using. Just slap the GPL on that, but they didn't want to put the GPL on that. Maybe they wanted to keep it a proprietary license or whatnot. VMware, they do support and have some open source software. They do some proprietary software as well, which kind of bugs me. Again, they are a member of the Linux Foundation, yet they do a lot of proprietary software. Also, VMware, when you license something under a free license like the GPL, you have to make the source code available. They were accused of not making some of their source code available. A quote from the Software Freedom Conservancy, quote, "While we are disappointed the courts did not take opportunity to deliver a clear pro-GPL precedent, the implications of the decision are limited. This certainly could proceed differently with different presentation of plaintiffs or in another jurisdiction." So basically, hey, if we brought this lawsuit to a different court, maybe in a different country like the US, who knows? They might have taken a very clear pro-GPL stance and VMware would not have had the same outcome. Which VMware is aware of that, and again, that's why they removed the offending code, because they don't want to be sued again, because the next time they appear in court, things might go a little bit differently. And the fourth story on the docket tonight is, have you been wanting to run your favorite Android apps on Linux? Well, there are ways to do that, but I want to show you a new project that is out there called SPURV. So this story comes from OMG Ubuntu. This article was written by Joey Snedden. is Android apps on Linux. So the dream of being able to run all your favorite Android apps on Linux distributions, such as Ubuntu here, of course in the case of OMG Ubuntu, well, you can, thanks to a promising new open source project called SPURV, S-P-U-R-V. So SPURV, it's the work of Collabora, a UK-based open source software consultancy and development outfit. One thing you need to know about SPURV, though, it's an experimental containerized Android environment that can run all your Android apps alongside regular desktop Linux apps under Wayland. So you have to have the Wayland display server, and you have to use the Wayland display server. Somebody like me that uses an NVIDIA card and needs the NVIDIA proprietary drivers, I'm not a Wayland user. I don't ever use Wayland because it's just not usable for me. I can't get the graphics drivers I need to run in Wayland. I can't use Wayland. So SPURV, not a great option for me. For those of you that are running AMD cards, though, SPURV might be an option. So Linux is not short on these sorts of, hey, you can run your Android apps in Linux. There are other things out there like Andbox in the past. Andbox is a free software project that basically lets you run Android apps on Linux, but it's a little bit different than what SPURV is trying to be. For one thing, SPURV is designed to be user-friendly, much more user-friendly than Andbox, for instance. SPURV also is very similar to a Windows project out there called BlueStacks. Those of you that run Windows may be familiar with BlueStacks. It's an Android emulator that lets you run all your Android apps on Windows in a windowed mode. Quote, like BlueStacks, SPURV creates an emulated Android device on your Linux system, but unlike BlueStacks, it's not an all-in-one runtime you can download and install. So SPURV, it's not this all-in-one solution. SPURV is a collection of tools that can be used to set up an Android container. It's this containerized environment. As far as performance, is this going to be really efficient performance-wise? No. So you're basically running a Android environment alongside a Linux environment. It's not exactly, the most efficient way to do this sort of thing, but being efficient is not the design of this. It's basically, do you really need to run an Android app on Linux? SPURV allows you to do that. I mean, Wine is not efficient either, but sometimes you really need to run a Windows app on Linux. Wine, I guess, kind of makes sense. So SPURV, you guys, if you are a Wayland user and you want to check it out, yeah, why not? I actually think it's pretty interesting, although I don't think there's not really that many mobile apps out there that I want to run, like on my Linux desktop. I did notice in the comments here on OMG Ubuntu, some folks were actually pretty excited. Some people were asking about, I guess there's mobile versions of Microsoft Office. But you know what? We have Microsoft Office working on Linux in Wine. That's a better option. Or just use Office 365 in the browser. Why run a mobile version? And the fifth and final story on the docket tonight is basically just a public service announcement. The next big Ubuntu and Fedora releases are getting really close because we now have the betas. There is a beta out for Ubuntu 19.04 and there is a beta out for Fedora 30. So let's start with, of course, Disco Dingo. Ubuntu 19.04 Disco Dingo just had its beta. Now, when Ubuntu releases a beta, release is imminent. So I think they're planning April 18th. I just off the top of my head. So in about 2 weeks, Ubuntu 19.04, the final release, will drop. So we're getting really close. The betas usually are really stable because the beta is only about 2 weeks out from the real release. If you want to go ahead and install the beta, you probably won't have any real issues, although technically, since it's a beta, I should tell you guys, don't put it on your main production machine and expect everything to work. There may be some bugs, but in my experience, the Ubuntu betas have always been pretty rock solid stable. Of course, there's links to the download here in this OMG announcement, OMG Ubuntu announcement. As far as some of the changes, of course, GNOME Shell 3.32, Linux kernel 5.0, Mesa 19.0. The Yaru icon set has been updated, so it's a new updated version of Yaru. There are new desktop icons, extensions, updated apps, and of course, new wallpapers. I will say the default wallpaper for Disco Dingo 19.04, It's fantastic. The best default wallpaper for Ubuntu since all the way back Ubuntu 8.04. Hardy Heron had a gorgeous default wallpaper. The other big release is Fedora. Just dropped their beta, Fedora 30, and this beta was actually released yesterday. Now Fedora, they plan on releasing sometime in the next month, but Fedora is notorious for never releasing on time. It's a running joke. If Fedora says, they're going to release something in May, it might be December before they release it. That has always been kind of how Fedora operated, but I will say Fedora 29 actually released on time. I think that was the only Fedora I've ever, in my time running Linux, I ever saw as far as it released on time was the last one, Fedora 29. So Fedora 30 may release on time. It's probably more of a beta than the Ubuntu beta. I probably wouldn't put Fedora 30 beta on a main production machine just yet, because there will be some bugs, again, because we're not really sure how far out the Fedora 30 official release is, because they never release on time. But same kind of thing. GNOME 3.32 is the desktop environment. The kernel, I believe, is 5.0, one of the latest 5 kernels. What is the beta release? A beta release is code complete and bears a very strong resemblance to the final release. If you take the time to download and try out the beta, you can check and make sure that things that are important to you are working. So if you want to check out the beta, check it out, see if, things work for you, all your apps work for you, all your hardware works for you, everything is supported, and then you can make a decision whether you want to maybe install the official release of Fedora 30 whenever it drops. And that was the 5th and final story for this edition of Taking Into Account. This was Taking Into Account episode 36. I try to release a new episode of Taking Into Account sometime every Thursday, so look for Taking Into Account episode 37 sometime next Thursday. Typically, I end these episodes of Taking Into Account by reading viewer question or a comment that I receive either on Mastodon, typically is where I get them, or from YouTube comments, or from email, or sometimes from Reddit. I'm not going to do that this week. I just want to mention, you guys probably noticed Taking Into Account was released Wednesday this week instead of Thursday. Why did I release it a day early this week? It's because I'm going to be really tied up on Thursday, tomorrow. I am having a new computer delivered, and I need to be here to sign for that new computer. Also, I need to do some massive backups of a lot of data this evening and all day tomorrow. So I'm going to be tied up tomorrow, basically getting my new computer up and working and getting all my backups and installing an operating system and whatever window managers I want to install, moving all my data around. So that is why I went ahead and released Taking Into Account episode 36 today rather than tomorrow. It's because I'm going to be playing with my new machine tomorrow. I may or may not get around to making a video discussing my new computer tomorrow, if not tomorrow, hopefully by Friday. As far as the new machine, I don't want to spoil it before I actually get it and unbox it and do something on video, but I just will say that I really needed better equipment for what I do here on the YouTube channel, so I dropped quite a bit of money on it, and I'll just leave you with this word: Threadripper. Before I go, this show was made possible by Ansem, Carlos, Chris, Douglas, Dylan, Leor, Rob, Robert, and Tony. They are the producers of the show. They are my highest tiered patrons over on Patreon. The show was also brought to you by all those ladies and gentlemen, all those names you see on the screen that help support my work over on Patreon. Without them, Taking Into Account episode 36 would not have been possible. I want to thank each and every one of those guys. If you'd like to support my work, please consider doing so. You'll find me at DistroTube over on Patreon. All right, guys. Peace.